Okay, thanks very much. I'm Charlie. I'm very happy to be here to give an overview of our TOCI paper. You can download it at that tiny URL. Be warned, it is quite a big paper. It's 60-odd pages. And I'm also very pleased that my co-authors are here at CHI, so Yo, Ben and Russell. So before we start, I'd just like to ask you to put your hands up if any of you have tried to change your behaviour recently. So maybe get more sleep, go to fewer parties, drink less, eat fewer cakes in the break. So mine's definitely up. And I want you to keep it up if you found it easy. I'm putting mine down. Okay, so I don't think anybody found it easy. So the key point there is that behaviour change is difficult. And then there's three key challenges with behaviour change. So it's known as a wicked problem. So there's incomplete and contradictory and changing requirements, very hard to define how to do it. And perhaps as a result of that, there's an awful lot of different approaches. So from a research point of view, it can be difficult to know where to start. And also, the evidence shows that actually very few interventions succeed in the long term. And so what we did is we used the lens of habits to address our research questions to help us understand both why behaviour change is hard and what we can do about it. And what the paper tries to do is to bring together the most pertinent theories and strategies into an explanatory model to help inform the design of interventions to target habits. So it's really trying to build on existing work and synthesise together lots of existing papers. So there's about 16 pages of references in the papers. So this is an overview of the paper. In the interest of time, I'm going to frame the research by just talking briefly about why habits are important, introduce the Habit Alteration Model, or the HAM, talk about some strategies to intervene, and finally cover some challenges. And our motivation was really that studying behaviour change is a little bit overwhelming. And we hope that people can use the paper as a starting point to structure the design space, not just of the theories, but also about techniques with our explanatory framework. Okay, so one reason behaviour change is hard is because of habits. And there's a clear research gap in considering habits as a key driver of long-term behaviour change. And so our contribution is addressing it by looking at theories and habits and interventions. So we need a definition. So this operational definition is based on Orwell, Verplanken and Gardner. So the idea is that through repetition of behaviour in a stable context, we can outsource the initiation of that behaviour to the environment, so it runs automatically, so outside of your conscious control. So we can preserve limited cognitive resources by doing this. And this is very much a challenge and an opportunity. So a challenge because the automaticity means it's difficult to change once it's been formed, but also an opportunity because that difficulty in changing means that once a good habit is formed, then you're likely to keep it. And this is just to illustrate how getting started in behaviour change can be overwhelming. So these are just some of the numbers of different change theories, techniques, strategies that other authors have identified. But even with the lens of habit, few theories directly address it. And there's also a research gap in considering habit as a key driver of behaviour change. So these are recent CHI behaviour change papers in blue. The mentions of habit are in red, and ones with actually substantive discussion of habits, so not just talking about habits colloquially, or in orange. So you can see there's very few oranges. And so what we've tried to do is bring together theories into a habit alteration model that we call the HAM. So we wanted to provide a theoretical and practical grounding to intervene using habits. And we outline several theories in the paper looking at how they deal with habits. But few do so. And so what we've done is bring three theories together to try and bridge that research gap in understanding how to change habits using technology. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of each of the three. So dual process theory essentially argues that behaviour emerges from the interplay of two distinct sets of processes. Type 1, which are non-conscious, cue-driven, impulsive, associative, automatic, parallel and fast, and type 2, which are slower, more conscious, goal-directed, rational serial processes. And why does our model use them? It's because we need to understand the underlying mechanisms of how we can actually translate cues into action. But we also need to understand how we can practically apply these. So we also need modern habit theory, which essentially sees habits as context-response links. So the context occurs and then the response will happen. And the habits are highly prevalent in everyday life across multiple domains. And it's important to note that the context can be external, so a location or a person or a particular item, or they can be internal, so like an emotion can be a cue to behaviour. And then the ham uses it to understand the successful formation of habits. For example, repetition in a stable context is really key to achieving automatic behaviour, such as habits. And lastly, goal-setting theory. So this tries to fill the theoretical gap in how to specify intentional behaviour, so type 2 type behaviour, things you'll deliberately want to do. And goal-setting theory, alongside saying that goals need to be accepted and that feedback is important, also says that hard, specific goals tend to be more effective than easy, vague ones. And so we use this to try and understand how best to form goals to drive that behavioural repetition that will form the habits. Okay, so what we've done is we've tried to put these puzzle pieces together to come up with an explanatory framework to help people research interventions. And what we're really trying to do is to come up with a practical tool to help people describe and assess habit targeting interventions. And in particular, to help them devise new interventions that don't just rely on the limited deliberative type 2 cognitive resources. So a quick overview of the model now. There's essentially 3 phases across the 2 types of process, so type 1 and type 2. So the 3 levels are filter, prepare, and act. In the phase 1 filter, so you have a set of cues that essentially flow through perception and type 1 and type 2 attention filters to create an input set of cues. And then in phase 2, the prepare phase, type 1 and type 2 memory processes match those input cues to potential responses, type 1 impulses or type 2 intentions. And then in the third phase, on the act phase, impulses and intentions compete to become a single response. So I'm just going to zoom into those phases one by one a little bit. So at the filter stage, we have F1, the context cues, which are always present. We have F2, the type 1 automatic attentional processes, and F3, the directed attentional processes. So you can see from the dotted lines which may or may not run. So that's trying to encapsulate the idea that you can put selective attention on particular cues. So what sort of interventions can we have at this phase? So one possible sort of intervention is priming. So it's essentially altering the context with a specific cue. And priming is the unobtrusive presentation of cues to try and activate those context response links. So it targets type 1 processes. So you provide the context cue and try and get a response, but they can be quite subtle. So for example, Bateson et al. Found that people paid nearly 3 times as much for their drinks as an honesty box in a coffee room when they showed the eyes rather than the control image of flowers, even though you don't consciously, if you were thinking about it, you wouldn't think you were actually being watched. And now in the prepare phase, we have that set of cues as inputs, and they interact with both type 1 and type 2 memory processes to generate potential outputs, which end up on the potential response stack. So type 1 outputs are impulses, and type 2 outputs are intentions, and impulses run faster. So habits may run down the left-hand side without you really noticing, particularly if your type 2 processes on the right are busy. And the sort of interventions we might see here really try and target those context response links. And one way to do that is to practice as an example of what to do. So we have late-breaking work, which is about getting people to practice pushing away a smartphone to try and control their overuse of smartphone. So the idea is you repeat the behaviour to try and jump that intention behaviour gap between type 2 conscious and type 1 non-conscious processes. And then in the act phase, after some arbitration between the type 1 impulses and type 2 intentions, we end up with a single response, which may have a particular outcome. For example, a corresponding change in the environment or a reward. And so a particular intervention here might be self-monitoring. So self-monitoring is essentially using information from self-tracking to form alternative intentions to act. And it can be helpful to find your unknown behaviour patterns. For example, if you use the free bikes for the conference, it might be helpful to know how far and how long you cycled for. And so this is the overview of the model, and just trying to emphasise that repetition is key. So information from observed response and outcomes will feed back into the model. And in terms of how habits are triggered, so a familiar cue might throw through the left-hand side down the type 1 attention filters and memory processes. So it's strongly associated with a particular response, so the corresponding impulse pops onto the potential response stack quite quickly. And in terms of habit formation, the key is to try and shift behaviour from type 2 on the right-hand side over to the left. Okay, so the paper outlines 10 different possible interventions across those 3 phases, filter, prepare and act, with the 2 different types, conscious and non-conscious, and gives some design strategies. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to give 2 concrete examples, which we found promising. These are promising because, in general, there's a problem of a lack of empirical evidence for whether these work or not. So we picked 2 strategies where there's meta-analysis showing an evidence of impact on behaviour, and they're interventions that aim to automate the conscious type 2 processes into non-conscious type 1 processes deliberately. And so they're implementation intentions and automating self-control. So implementation intentions are specific if-then plans that try to link ifs, so the context or a set of cues, with a response then. So it's deliberately trying to shift from the right-hand side to the left-hand side of the model, because in type 2, the left-hand side, they run faster, so they're more likely to be enacted. And in terms of evidence, Presswich et al. Found that implementation intention groups increased daily walking. There's strong meta-analysis evidence, a medium to large magnitude effect, and implementation intentions are seen as a good strategy for habit formation. The next intervention is thinking about how we might be able to automate self-control. So self-control is the ability to alter your own behavioural patterns. So you can prevent or inhibit the dominant response. So that's implies that you can introspect the potential response stack, so you can see what's in there and put an alternative on there. So it is part of type 2 processes, but there's some evidence that repeating or practicing those stop behaviours, you can automate it into a type 1 process, which was what Lawrence et al. Did. So they used training to inhibit simple motor responses. So the task is to say if the picture's on the right or the left, except if the frame is bold. So the healthy things, the apple, you want people to respond left or right, and the unhealthy things, the chocolate, you want people to stop themselves from responding. And they found an impact on outcomes, so actually on weight loss and reduced energy take. So very briefly, as with any intervention, we've got some challenges. Context sensing and sensing behaviour is very difficult. Evaluation is difficult, particularly because habits can form slowly. We need to think about the experiment design, and we really want to make sure that we measure behaviour, especially because habits are difficult to introspect. And theories are undergoing some development as well, and we really need to test these strategies, particularly the interplay of a good combination of type 1 and type 2 for an individual. So overall, we were really hoping that this paper will provide guidance for those working and starting out in the area. I basically wrote the paper I wish I'd had 8 years ago. And we really want to help researchers to consider the role of habits in the behaviour they're targeting, and consider how to use the ham to design interventions to target type 1 processes and type 2 processes. And finally, just to flag up that technology can play a role, but it doesn't have to be the only solution. So those are my contact details. Please do contact me to discuss. Thank you to the ACM for a travel grant. I'm also part of an ethical technology cooperative, so I'm here through the kindness of my co-workers, so thanks for that. And thank you for listening, so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hello, Mauro Cherubini, University of Lausanne. Thanks so much for your talk. Great work. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you choose these different psychological theories. In particular, I was wondering if why you, for instance, you didn't pick like a self-determination theory as one of the theories that could be used to form the framework you described.
Sure. So the paper goes through a set of different theories, kind of looking at how they deal with habits, and we didn't feel like self-determination theory really helped us to explain habitual behaviour. So I think self-determination theory tends to focus more on kind of conscious feelings of whether you can achieve a given goal or not, or how your intentions are formed. So what we tried to do was to pick the theories that we thought together gave people a framework to be able to think about both conscious and non-conscious approaches to behaviour change.
Thank you.
Hi, Dama DeFranco at Cornell University. Great work. Really loved the theoretical model. I'm sure you're familiar with one of the difficulties in doing this work, particularly with intervention strategies, is the long-term effect, whether it continues working on the long term, and when the intervention is no longer there, you stop the intervention, does that behavior change persist afterwards? Can you maybe speak a little bit about if there are any parts of your model or any parts of the things you looked at that might suggest efficacy in increasing behavior change, even when interventions and strategies have stopped, being there?
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. I guess what we're trying to say is that the key to long-term behaviour change is actually to try and form habits. So that is the fundamental point. And I guess things that form habits faster are more likely to help in the long term, and habits that don't contend with other existing behaviours. So one of the things is you don't want to, if you have an existing habit, for example, of cleaning your teeth, one thing you can do is try and chain habits together. So I think there's some research to show that if you floss your teeth after you've cleaned your teeth, because you already have some mechanism in place to automate behaviour, trying to hook behaviours onto that can be helpful. But at the same time, what you don't want to do is try and assign two habits or two different sets of behaviours to the same cue, because otherwise you get a clash and then it's not really clear what sort of behaviour will evolve. So I think there's a lot of interesting research to be done about sensing what cues trigger behaviour and trying to make sure that there's no kind of cue clash in those cue response links.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Time for one last question. I don't know who was first.
Can I ask?
The audience. Okay.
Sorry.
Yes. Well, I'm sure you know how to find Charlie during the break. Yes, we have one person in the audience.
Okay, thank you. Yitong Huang from Nottingham University. Thank you for the talk. Because there's a taxonomy of behavior change techniques, some tap onto the reflective system and some tap onto the automatic system. And there's also a taxonomy of different digital media like wearables, smartphones, or modes of delivery in the behavior science language. So I wonder what your thoughts are on the link, whether there's any linkage or mapping between the two taxonomies. Are certain media, digital media, better for delivering certain types of behavior change techniques or tap onto certain system?
So I think that's a really interesting open research area. I think it's not really clear yet what platforms are better for what types of interventions. I mean, there's some obvious ones, so mobile ones, we obviously want some sort of mobile technology, but in terms of how you use increasingly pervasive technology to intervene to help people change their behaviour, I think that's a broad, open research question.